Hey guys, OG Albini here, bringing you guys a brand new series to the channel. An SPL draft notes, we will be going over everything and anything SPL related. This includes recaps, matchup analysis, and highlight Pokemon from the week prior and this week that I think that you should look out for. This week in particular, we're only going to be able to cover highlight mons and matchup analysis because no games have been played, but we still have plenty of content to go over. If you guys are excited for this series, be sure to drop a like as well as subscribe to the channel. We are on our way to 3,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And if everybody who watches this video drops a sub, I should get there by the end of today. Alrighty, with that being said, let's jump on into it. Now, like I said, unfortunately we don't have any games just yet, so this week we'll only be going over the matchup and highlight Pokemon in said matchups, and I'll give you my pick on who I think will win each game. First up, we have Seabad versus Danny in a really fun and offensive matchup. From Seabad's side, he has the really threatening Iron Bundle, but Danny actually has the rare, really solid Iron Bundle matchup. Between Pokemon like Spadef Jirachi and Spadef Sylveon, I don't see many openings for Bundle to come in and do much damage itself. It seems much better suited to Flip Turn or U-Turn out and get in other offensive members that Seabad has. Speaking of said offensive members, Ogerpon Hearthflame goes absolutely crazy in this matchup. Between Ivy Cudgel, Grass Stab, and the Tech Rock Tomb for Pokemon like Charizard and Ninetales, this Pokemon has no switch-ins. One SD and a little bit of chip on some things, and it genuinely might be over. Defensively on the physical side, Donphan's going to be really important in checking Pokemon like Okidogi before they get out of hand, because it really can put in some work after some bulk ups. Press is also especially important on the specially defensive side. Walking Wake is very strong here, and it's the only Pokemon on this team that isn't absolutely nuked by it. However, if it is Specs special attack boosting in the sun, it does get to it KO by Hydro Steam, so Chase is going to have to be very careful about that. If I'm Seabad, my plan is to get up hazards, use that bundle to get in mons like Ogerpon, and click buttons, hopefully win the game. As for Danny's side, I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think a Pokemon like Walking Wake goes absolutely crazy in this game. If I were him, I'd take the angle of Specs special attack boosting, as it does just 2-hit KO or OHKO every single member on Seabad's team. It does have a rough speed tier in this matchup, but if it can find the right opportunities to come in, it's pretty much an instant KO. He can also take the route of chipping Crest down to where he can 2-hit KO with the speed boosting spec set and then have that speed control as well. Funny enough, a Pokemon like Charizard also looks very strong here. It's one of Danny's Terra captains, and Terra Fairy actually lets it kind of soft check that Ogerpon pretty well, allowing it to Terra Fairy, avoid a Rock Tomb, and hopefully take that thing out, as it's a really big threat to this team. I also think that Healing Wish on Ninetales could prove to be a very valuable asset. Again, in this matchup, I think Danny should take the same approach of hazards, get in Wake, and pick KOs when you can. In my opinion, this is a pretty darn even matchup, but despite having Walking Wake as the highlight mon because I think it does the best on paper, I think Seabad's team has more to deal with Danny's defensively than Danny does for Seabad's offense. So I'm going to give Seabad a slight nod in this one. Next up, we have Envy versus Kyle in a very interesting matchup. You see, the highlight mon I have here is actually going to be Beartic, funny enough, and while you typically don't see this thing in the draft format too often, the fact that this Pokemon can Terra, especially into an electric type, makes it a very big threat against Envy's team. If Kyle can get up the snow, Terra Electric and either SD up or just be Life Orb maybe and click some buttons, this thing is a big threat between Ice Stab, Electric Stab, and fighting coverage for the Gudra Hisui. He can honestly even go just Terra Ice if he feels comfortable beating down the Manaphy, but I'd personally like to have coverage for that thing. Another Pokemon that does really well on Kyle's side is going to be that Roaring Moon. Fatter Roaring Moons under Veil are going to find plenty of setup opportunities, especially when Pokemon like Weezing get chipped and whittled down. Rillaboom will also be a very important member on Kyle's team this week, not because it does incredibly offensively, but because it revenges Pokemon like Manaphy, Ursaluna Blood Moon, but it also forces knockoffs on things like Galarian Weezing, which is really nice for Pokemon like Beartic and Roaring Moon. There's also always that possibility that Zoroark disguises itself as something like a Roaring Moon, or something like a Beartic, and gets a big hit off on that physically defensive wall, thinking it's coming in to check it. Now on Envy's side, there is no shortage of threats. I think that Manaphy looks great on his side. Personally, with like a Rindo Tail Glow set, I think you can put in a lot of work in this matchup. Ursaluna Blood Moon is also really good here. It doesn't have great switch-ins defensively, and I think a fatter set with Moonblast can really help deal with that Roaring Moon that might give him some trouble. That'll also free up the Galarian Weezing to check other things, which is nice to not overload it. Speaking of the Weezing, it does feel like a necessity. A Rocky Helmet set does seem very solid, and checking a lot of this physical offense, whether it be the Roaring Moon, Tauros Paldea Aqua, the Rillaboom, or even the Beartic. Other offense on Envy's side that looks great is going to be Pokemon like Terra Fairy Espeon, which does hit this team incredibly hard. On paper, there's not much that takes it on. Potentially Pokemon like Noctowl and Colossal can pivot in, but not for a long time. Sneasler also puts on a ton of pressure in this game, really forcing a Pokemon like Gligar or Terraghost Colossal to come. But if it's Terraghost Colossal, that means it's not Terra Electric Beartic, which is really valuable for Envy. And on top of that, Gligar isn't the best Pokemon in the world right now, just because of the fact that it did lose Roost. It's not the most reliable thing. Plus, those free U-turns that Sneasler's going to grab on it might get in your Manaphy to come in, set up, or just click a button. I think Thundurus is really good for similar reasons, and the fact that it really does force in that Gligar to get in other members of Envy's team. Envy's key is really going to be keeping up momentum here and not giving Kyle the opportunity to set up his Veil and win the game, but I am going to give a slight nod to Kyle on matchup, just because I think the offensive Roaring Moon plus Beartic can be really overwhelming for Envy, on top of big wildcards like Mew that we haven't even mentioned yet. Next up, we have 6-foot Hacks versus Invivid Color, and the highlight mod in this matchup has got to be Infernape. If you look at the combination of its dual stabs plus Mach Punch, they are quite literally unguardable. I think a Swords Dance variant could really just pull up and win the game, but honestly, a Choice Band or Choice Scarf set also looks very solid. Infernape also serves as a nice pivot into Chi-Yu, not necessarily a counter, but it can always switch in and force it out potentially. Might be another reason you think of Scarf, but Mach Punch will probably pick that thing off with little to no chip. Tornadus Therian on Leo's side also looks very strong. The combination of Hurricane, Knockoff, and Heat Wave does really well in this game. He could always go with tried and true Stallbreaker Torn, but I think AV might be better here. It checks Pokemon like Greninja, Chi-Yu, and Goldango much better. Don't count Vivid out though, because I think he genuinely might completely overwhelm Leo with his offense. Chi-Yu has no switch-ins at all. It is one Psychic away from blowing up that Infernape, and everything else gets to it, KO'd or OHKO'd depending on the set. Mixed Greninja with a Tech Gong Shot for Scream Tail also does really well, and Scarf Cleavor will function as another solid Torn Revenger and gets up an offensive Stealth Rock. Abomasnow may have to act as a makeshift Abomasnow pivot, or Fizdef fighting Decidueye would also get the job done, but I lean a Terra Water Abomasnow. I think this matchup is really close, but I am going to lean Leo here, just because of the insane offensive pressure that Infernape gives, as well as scary Pokemon like Haxorus and Mamoswine that we haven't even really mentioned here. Next up, we have Mephisto versus Shuckle King here in a really fun matchup. Both coaches have really interesting squads. On Mephisto's side, I think the most important Pokemon, not just on his team, but in the matchup in general, is going to be that Scizor. One, it looks incredible offensively. Outside of the Talonflame, Shuckle really doesn't have great answers to the Scizor, but on top of that, it's very important to revenge Shuckle's scary offense. Pokemon like Garchomp tend to get pretty whittled and chipped, and if it Swords Dances and Scale Shots, it's probably not doing so for free, and it's probably going to be put in Bullet Punch range. Meowscarada obviously can't really beat Scizor 1v1, it's always typically forced out or revenged by Bullet Punch when it's low. Bullet Punch is great for the Enamoras, and it checks the Monkey Dory very well. Focus Blast is going to be its best coverage option for it, which isn't going to OHKO. U-Turn is going to obviously knock out the Monkey Dory, so it'll be able to grab good momentum, but it can also beat down Pokemon like Bronzong and Sylveon and the Bramblegast as well. It may want to go with Protective Pads or Punch and Glove set in order to not get Flame Body procced by the Talonflame, which is a very viable option on Shuckle's end. Outside of that, Cinderace seems very strong here. Either a Choice Band set can do a lot of work, or a heavy-duty boot set with Will-O-Wisp in order to catch Pokemon like Garchomp off guard could be really great. It's also another Pokemon that forces in the Talonflame, which could be really valuable for an endgame SD Scizor. If I'm Mephisto, my endgame plan is to get up spikes with something like Hisui and Samurott to either win with a Scarf Gengar, which also does very well in this game in my opinion, or an SD Scizor later on in the game. Now on Shuckle's side, he has some very viable options as well. Meowscarada can be used really well in order to force knockoffs on the Zapdos to really help out the Garchomp in winning with a Swords Dance Scale Shot set. And Amorous has great coverage across the board between Moonblast, Earth Power, and Mystical Fire. It just needs to find the right click. But Berry can also be a very viable option in order to allow itself to stay in on the Scizor and pick it off or burn Knocka Berry with a Mystical Fire. Taking that trade is honestly super worth with the rest of Shuckle's team. Another Pokemon that may be worthwhile is Defog Girder. It beats the Hisui and Samurott really well, and it can knock off a bunch of items just like that Meowscarada, and checks a lot of the offense on Mephisto's team. If I'm Shuckle, I'm spreading knockoffs, keeping hazards away, and hopefully winning with a late game SD Chomp, or even like a Monkey Dory Scarf set if, they do end up getting rid of that Scizor. Sludge Wave endgame does look pretty okay. Next up, we have Gentleman Thomas versus Numb Nexus, and this is another really fun matchup. You can see our highlight Pokemon here is going to be Baxcalibur. This thing goes absolutely crazy in this matchup. The combination of Dual Stabs plus Earthquake can really put in a lot of hurt to this team. I also think it forces very specific prep on Nexus' side. I think he's either forced into a Booster Energy Speed or more than likely a Scarf variant in order to never lose to +1 Baxcalibur. King Gambit also may be forced into a Shuka Berry roll, just so he can always eat a hit, but if it's random Brick Break or Fighting coverage Baxcalibur, Nexus is in for a tough time. Galarian, Slowking, and Gliscor also look very important as defensive pivots. Slowking is a very great Valiant check, but it is kind of forced into a Colbur Berry roll, just so it doesn't get blown up by a Swords Dance knockoff variant, which may open up the rest of Nexus' special attackers, like Hisui and Electrode, and Iron Moth. Gliscor may step in that Spadef role. It looks really incredible in this matchup. Despite losing Roost, I think the combination of Earthquake, Spikes, Toxic, and Protect can do really well. It checks Pokemon like Iron Moth phenomenally, as well as gets up pretty free spikes on a team like this. Mandibuzz can come in and try and defog, but it doesn't really matter when you can just Toxic, Protect, Spike, and whittle it down to where it's eventually just going to either die, or you're always going to end up with at least 1 or 2 spikes. Now on Nexus' side, he has some pretty scary offense as well. Despite Valiant not having the best matchup in the world, I think Gambit looks really solid. Either a Swords Dance Shuka or Weakness Policy set can put in a lot of work here. Honestly, Dual Stabs is all that's needed because the Water type is also part Fairy, so it's not, resistant to Iron Head. Really, the Dual Stabs don't have a resist outside of the Tauros, which doesn't have reliable recovery, and obviously can potentially proc a Defiant from King Gambit, and, a bunch of different things. I think King Gambit is a really viable endgame option, basically. And funny enough, Ogerpon Cornerstone, which is a Pokemon I'm not personally super big on, looks very good here. If you look at Thomas's team, he doesn't have a rock resist at all. So, a potential Swords Dance Trailblaze set could put in a lot of work if Nexus is able to find the opportunity to get it done. It's also a solid spiky here in that regard. This matchup really does come down to who out-offenses who first, and I personally think that is going to be Thomas because he does have good checks to the top end of Nexus' roster, where I think Nexus just doesn't have viable counterplay to a Pokemon like Baxcalibur, or even Pokemon like Azumarill, which don't have great switch-ins. So overall, I'm going to lean this one in Thomas's favor. The next matchup we're going to be covering is going to be Drewby and his New York Mirage versus Uzi Gunner and his Bullet Punch Club. From Uzi's side, Weavile goes absolutely insane with its Dual Stabs. I'm so excited to see this thing come back. Now, there are means of revenging it in the potential of Low Kicks as well as Conkeldurr, but if this thing does find opportunities to come in, it just knocks something off for free. Knockoff plus Icicle Crash is really strong here. Ice Shard also looks great, and then fourth move can either be something like a Protect or a Low Kick. Either one works, but I do think this thing is very strong here. Another Pokemon that is likewise very strong here is going to be a Booster Energy Tusk. I think a Booster Energy attack with a combination of a Mega Horn, Ice Spinner, and then ground coverage and Earthquake or Headlong Rush does really, really well here. The fourth move can be Rapid Spin in order to get away hazards, but especially get that speed boost going to do a lot of damage. That Slowbro really isn't going to appreciate taking a Mega Horn on the switch-in, so if you can catch that thing aggressively, you basically got a KO locked down, and I'm pretty sure it dies to a Headlong Rush and a Mega Horn anyways if you are booster attack. There is the flip side though, in the sense that defensive Tusk may be a necessity here because Hisuian Arcanine also looks very, very strong otherwise. So we may see a defensive Tusk. It still is a little bit annoying to switch into, but something like Slowbro can definitely take him out a little bit easier in that case. Another Pokemon I almost put as the highlight mon in this matchup was going to be Uzi's Terra Water Kilowattrel. It really does look absolutely incredible. It also walls a Terra Ice Hisuian Electrode, which I think is a very, very valuable tool in this matchup. Because of the Volt Absorb, you're not going to take electric moves, and you're going to take not very effective from the ice moves. And on top of that, electric flying water hits this team perfectly. There's absolutely nothing that switches into that triple stab combination. So the Terra Water Kilowattrel looks really, really powerful here. Shaman also looks really solid here as an Ogerpon Wellspring check. The only issue is that it does allow free U-turns into Pokemon like Arcanine. So if you're not rocking out the defensive Tusk, or it's gone, or it's chipped, you might be giving up a KO every time your Shaman comes in, so you gotta be really careful. In order for Uzi to win this game, I think early rocks are going to be important to force chip on these pivots and to force chip on Pokemon like Arcanine and Lokix if they're not going to be boots. From there, I think his offense can go crazy. From Drewby's side, he has some pretty big threats too. Wellspring looks very solid with U-turn, stabs, and a stomping tantrum. Scarf Arcanine also looks very solid. Fire resist on this team are pretty darn flimsy. It's only going to be a Pokemon like Skeledirge and Dragalge, and I guess Sudowoodo if you want to count that. So Flare Blitz looks pretty strong and pretty free. There's also a potential of a choice band set, but I'm not too sure about its speed tier. Especially because a Pokemon like Shaman that you typically like to force out might outspeed and knock you out with an Earth Power. Another Pokemon that's surprisingly strong here is going to be Trevenant. I think a Terra Fairy set with either Hornleech or, I think Power Up if it gets it, but Hornleech and Poltergeist and then Terra Blast Fairy looks really strong into Uzi's team. He does not have great counterplay to a set like that. Another Pokemon that feels very strong is going to be Lokix. It looks really, really strong here in revenging a lot of things, or at least forcing Protects, or getting off really strong resisted Tinted Lead boosted U-turns. Outside of that, I could see a Pokemon like Assault Vest Conkeldurr coming because it does soft check some things on Uzi's team like a Skeledirge and a Cryogonal and things like that, but it also forces a revenge on something like Weavile, and it checks the new and improved Empoleon with competitive as its ability. Something I did forget to mention from Uzi's side, and I want to mention it before we went on to the next round, is that because Tusk may be forced more defensive, I forgot he still has an Ursaluna. So if Tusk is more defensive, that may open Ursaluna to be more offensive, and that thing definitely doesn't have switch-ins either, just has a rougher speed tier. This is another really, really tough matchup, but I think if Uzi can keep up offensive momentum and get in Pokemon like offensive Tusk or Ursaluna, as well as a Pokemon like Weavile and Kilowattrel, I think he'll be in a pretty good spot, especially if he controls the speed game like he should in a matchup like this. I'm going to lean Uzi on this one. And lastly, we have Viz versus Pokeaim, a really, really cool matchup here. Big threats on both sides. You can see my highlight mon this week is going to be Quaquaval. If you look at Viz's team, he does not have consistent counterplay to a Moxie, Aqua Step, and Quaquaval. The combination of water plus ice against his roster is really, really overbearing. Pokemon like Corviknight can potentially soft check it, but other than that, there really isn't much that takes it on, and it doesn't take much for a Corviknight to be put in range of a close combat once that Quaquaval gets to boosting. Dragapult looks to be a really important partner for Quaquaval as well, because it forces in Pokemon like Tinglu, allowing Quaquaval to come in for free, maybe even set up, or just start clicking buttons to whittle down its own checks. And of course, we have to mention the Terra Electric Torterra. Grass plus Electric is actually pretty strong against Viz's team, so he's going to have to be very careful about that combination if the Torterra decides to come off the bench. Now on Viz's side, he has a pretty terrifying team as well. Pokemon like Dragonite can do really well if Clefable is removed or chipped. Armarouge actually looks really strong. Fire plus fighting coverage is really, really powerful into a team like this, as long as something like Dragapult is maybe chipped into a range of a Psychic, or even a Stored Power if it is going to be a weak armor Calm Mind weakness policy set. Now, the biggest threat from Viz's side is going to be that Annihilate. It does really, really well here. Honestly, whether it be a bulk up variant or a choice scarf variant, it looks very, very powerful. It's going to have trouble finding opportunities to boost its Rage Fist, but if it can pivot in on weaker attacks, it's going to come in and it's going to click Rage Fist against Joey's team, and there's not much he could do about it defensively. If I'm Viz, I'm trying to get up as much hazards as possible with Pokemon like Tinglu to hopefully win with either Dragonite or Annihilate or the Armor Rouge. Also, Terra Water Basculin. Completely forgot to mention, but man oh man, if you look at the water resist on Joey's side, they're not great. If Appleton does not come off the bench, Terra Water Wave Crash from Adaptability Basculin looks very, very powerful and very, very strong. I am going to give the slight lean to Joey in this one because I think this might be one of the better Quaquaval matchups I have ever really seen. But Viz can definitely pull this one out with his really cool offense and honestly lower tiers like Basculin helping out higher tiers like Annihilate. That's going to be it for SPL Draft Notes Week 1. Again, a pretty short video this week, but we have no games or scores to go over, no cool plays from the previous week, because obviously there hasn't been any games. That's really what I tend to cover, or plan on covering in this series. I want to cover the previous week's results. I want to go over any really cool plays or really standout sets or anything like that from the week prior, and then we'll do what we did today. Go over the matchups, point out some highlight Pokemon, and then give our pick'ems for the week. If you guys have any other ideas for the series that you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments below. Also, drop your pick'ems for in the comments below as well. I want to see how right we all are. I'm going to keep track of my pick'ems for the season to see how I end up doing, but let me know what you guys think down there. And yeah, with that being said, again, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to watch this video, and I would really appreciate it if you dropped a sub. It would really help me out a ton. Alrighty, with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.